So we're going to be transferring from this broth. We have a broth here of Serratia marsaceens. And it smells, I know when I open it, but it's a liquid broth, so you're going to have to take a liquid sample and transfer it to the different types of media that I have for y'all. I have it's all made with nutrient agar, but I have another nutrient broth, so a broth to a broth will be one of the transfers. A broth to a slant tube, so I don't know if y'all can see that in there, but I poured the agar at an angle, so you have a slant that you've got to transfer onto. And then this is called a deep tube, and we're going to write all that up here in a minute. But this one just is agar that goes straight across, and then you have a streak plate that we'll also do. So you'll have to be able to transfer your micro. Right now, hopefully, all that's in that broth there is Serratia marsaceens, nothing else in there. And so when y'all do your transfer and you grow your microbe on all of these different types of media here, hopefully only Serratia grows on it. No, nothing else, just Serratia. That will mean that you were able to transfer aseptically, right? That you did it correctly. And then I listed up here just the terms that are in your lab manual of what it means to transfer aseptically. Your goal is to not contaminate yourself, to not contaminate anyone else, to not contaminate your table or anything around you, and that your culture and your sterile media only have the Serratia marsaceens in them, that you're not introducing any other microbe into that. Let's talk about your microbe for a second. We picked Serratia marsaceens for a very specific reason. Serratia marsaceens. Serratia marsaceens is a gram-negative rod-shaped bacteria. Gram-negative rod-shaped bacteria. The reason, mainly the only reason that I pick it for this lab, that we pick it for this lab, is that Serratia, when it grows on a medium, when it colonizes, it produces a red pigment. And so it's very easy to tell if it's the only one on your plate when you look at it, because if you have white colonies or purple colonies or whatever it may be, anything other than the red colonies that is Serratia, you know that you introduced something else onto your sample. Because it colonizes red, it produces a red pigment inside the colonies, it has a lot of history behind it, Serratia does. It was used, now we recognize it as a significant medical pathogen, but it didn't used to be that way. 40 years ago, it was not on the radar. It was used pretty blatantly because it pigmented red. You could tell if it was somewhere. And so they would use it for tracing and to see how something was spread and things like that. You even have references of Serratia marsaceens being linked to the body of Christ and things like that on bread, because Serratia likes really starchy foods. Bread's pretty starchy, and so it would grow on bread and it would make the bread look like it was bleeding. And so you see some references to that in history. Fast forward a little bit, and you saw it being used in schools and laboratory settings where they were doing like some contact tracing. They would rub Serratia on their hands and then go about their day, and then they would later come back and swab different places to see how far it had spread just from it being on their own hands, like who all had come in contact with it. And because it grew red, you could tell that's what you have. There's one real famous instance that I think is pretty applicable to today, where there was a professor who he wanted to prove that microbes could be spread quite vastly just from speaking in front of a room. And so he gargled a broth of Serratia marsaceans and then lectured to an empty room. And then they came back the next day and took samples and cultured it to see how far it had spread. And he was in one of those big lecture pits, and all the way at the back of basically an auditorium, they were able to isolate Serratia marsaceans. And so it does seem to be very aerosol spread. Makes me think of today and everybody wearing masks, right? On what we're spreading when we don't wear them. But then you move ahead a little bit and you saw it used in some bioterrorism preventative strategies, not as a bioterrorism weapon, but the U.S. in the 1950s, I believe, about 1956 or so, they went off of the coast of San Francisco, there in California. They went off the coast and they went out far enough, took the military ships out there and all that stuff, and they sprayed Serratia marsaceans into the surf. And what they wanted to see is if a foreign country came through and sprayed a microbe that would make everybody sick, would it ever actually reach the mainland, and how far would it progress? And they used Serratia because it didn't make people sick, and so it was very easy to identify if Serratia was the one because it would pigment red, and so they would know where it all grew, and people didn't get sick from it, or so they thought. And so what they found was that actually the Serratia spread not only onto the mainland there on the beach, but they were picking up Serratia all the way into communities and neighborhoods far in off the coast of California. And it ended up, nobody knew they did it, right? It was secretive. Nobody knew they did it, but the military was keeping tabs on the public health in the hospitals and stuff, and it ended up, they had quite a few people, I think several hundred, who showed up with a respiratory illness at the hospital, and Serratia marsaceans was isolated from their samples. And so once, I forget the years, I think it was in the 70s when it became public. Like they could, every so many years they're able to release whatever from the military. And once it got time for this to be released and they released it, the people who read that kind of stuff read it and made everybody aware. People were really upset, obviously. And so now there's an agreement that they won't do that anymore with any of the microbes or test anything on anybody without anybody knowing. And that's not the only time that's happened, right? So they've gone through subway systems and sprayed stuff trying to see how it would trace back. But so Serratia was used for a lot of that. Today, we know that Serratia is pretty significant. I went and pulled up the recent stats, and this isn't anything you don't have to write this down, but this is interesting. So on our break, I went and seen what Serratia is currently listed as. Currently, Serratia is ranked 5th on the list of infections resulting from people being in the ICU. So 6.5% of all gram-negative infections in the ICU are from Serratia marsaceans, which that's significant, but that's still low. It's currently the 7th most common cause of pneumonia. And it's also, Serratia is currently showing resistance to ampicillin, amoxicillin, amoxiclav, which is augmentin, and cephalosporin. So it's showing some antibiotic resistance because we've been doing this for a while. And so, Serratia is your microbe of the week. How this will be set up as far as how you're doing this part. Let's see, let's write. Sterile rock, sterile slant tube, sterile deep tube, and a transfer your Serratia marsaceens, which is in a broth, you're going to transfer it to each of these things here. So let's talk about how to do that. Serratia is a biosecurity level 1, so we are going to use our metal inoculating loops and needles. So I'm going to grab so these are your metal ones, right? Not the disposable ones. We don't need those for now. But some of these you're going to use a loop for, and some of them you're going to use a inoculating needle. So the needle is the one that does not have the loop on the end, and the inoculating loop is the one with the loop on the end. We're also going to use the Bunsen burners for this one. So when y'all come in here on Thursday, we'll light the Bunsen burners, and that's what you'll use to flame your stuff as you try to maintain aseptic technique. So let's start with the sterile broth. So let's say I've got maybe a little bigger. I will have y'all some sterile small beakers out here. You're going to come over to the broth in the incubator, and you're going to pour yourself a very tiny amount. You don't need very much. You don't need a full beaker. You need like 1/8 of an inch, right? You need very little. You're going to cut off some paraffin, which is wax paper. So the back side, the white side, is not it. It's this clear, waxy looking side. You're going to cut some of that off, and you're going to cover your beaker after you get the Serratia out so that you don't breathe on it or walk around and stuff fall in it. Try to keep it as sterile as possible, or pure as possible. So you got your micro. You'll bring it back to where you're working, and you'll have all your different stuff that you're transferring to. Labeling will be a big deal. It's not as big of a deal this time because you only have one micro, and you have one of each. And so as long as you can remember what they're called, other than putting your name on it, you don't really have to do a lot of labeling. But labeling whatever you need to before you ever get started. The Bunsen burner is lit. Will be lit. With the broth, you're going to use a loop. So if you're making notes, that's what you need to make a note of there, is that for a broth to broth transfer, you use an inoculating loop. The goal here is that you are able to do this without anybody's help. And you're able to hold everything in your own hands and take the lid off, put the lid on without setting anything down. Because if you set the lid on the table, what happens? It contaminates, it picks up a micro. If you set the tube down open, it will pick up a micro. So you gotta hold everything and try to do it together. Try, right? You gotta try to see if you can do it yourself. Your Bunsen burner will be lit. So first thing you'll do is you're going to flame your metal inoculating loop, and you'll just hold it over the flame until it turns red. And then once it turns red, you'll pull it off and let it cool for just a second, right? If you dip it into your Serratia when it's still red hot, you're going to kill whatever you touch. So give it a second. Dip your microbe out. Take the lid off of your broth. Flame the end of your test tube. So just a 1-2 real quick over the end of the test tube. Run it across the flame. Then you're going to take your inoculating loop that's got your Serratia on it, and you're going to dip it down into your broth. You're going to try not to touch the sides of the test tube. Right? Hard to do. And then give it a little switch, trying not to touch the sides of the test tube. And you pull it back out, flame the mouth of the test tube again, put the lid back on. All without setting anything down. And then you can flame this again. You shouldn't have to flame this every time unless you want to. I like to, just in case I goofed up one, I don't goof up all my others. So I would prefer flaming it every time just to be safe. But holding it all together is kind of awkward at first, and it'll get better. But try not to set anything down or touch anything. That's the broth. Now, the slate tube. The slant tube, you will also use a loop for. The slant tube is a solid one, so it's not liquid, and you have two solid tubes. One has agar that was poured and it just sat there and solidified straight across. The other one is the slant. You see how the agar, I let it solidify a slant, so you have that slant there. If you're looking in your lab, you can look at, Brittany's there if you need to. Look at your lab on page, what page did I get on?
31.
On page 39. There is a somewhat decent picture there of somebody inoculating a slant. Do you see the little zigzag they're making with they're using a disposable lube. So the procedure is the same. You flame everything, dip when you need to, hold it in your hand without setting anything down. All that is still the same. But when you inoculate this, again, try not to touch the test tube, but you're going to go in here and you're going to gently set your loop down on the slant of the agar and do that zigzag and drag it across agar and pull it back out. And that's it, you've inoculated it. So when you see growth on it, it should be in your zigzag pattern. The deep tube. The deep tube, you're going to use a needle on. An inoculating needle. The deep tube is the other tube that has the agar solidified straight across. And this one, again, the procedure's all the same. You flame everything, dip your needle in there. Try not to set anything down. You're going to do 3 stabs. So you don't re-dip. You don't re-dip in between stabs. You just dip once into your serratia. And then you're going to take this and you're going to do 3 different stabs down into the agar in 3 different spots. And that's it. You try not to touch anything. Flame everything, put the lid back on, and that one's all done.
That was the needle. That slant tube, do we use the loop?
The loop on the slant tube. How to do all of that is written in your lab manual, or typed up in your lab manual. So, for example, on page 35, there's procedural diagram 1.16, a broth to a broth. And it has step-by-step instructions on how to transfer from a broth to a broth. So when y'all write up your lab, and you're looking for that procedure in here to copy into your own lab report, there's the broth to broth.
What page is that?
Just 35, sorry, 35. And you got the picture diagram there, or you actually have a written out one on page 34, whichever you prefer. 1.26 on page 38 has the procedural diagram for transferring from a slant to a slant. Now, we didn't do that. We transferred from a broth to a slant. So the only part you would need out of this is that second half where you're actually transferring to a slant. So you'd have to combine the 2 previous, like the broth procedure with this slant one. But this tells you how to transfer something to a slant on page 38.
So it's the bottom half right here.
Do what?
So it's like a pink color?
The pink one?
Yeah,
Yes, yes. Okay. Now the other one is, look on page 45. Page 45 actually has a picture of Serratia marsaceus growing on plates. So y'all can get a visual on what that looks like. See how red it is? So it's real easy to pick out if that's the one that you have, because most things don't do that. But that's Serratia growing. Now, the street plate is our last one. If you flip to page 47, there are several pictures here of how to do a street plate dilution. At the top, 1.35A, B, C, and D show pictures of how to, and I'm gonna show you how to do it, but there shows pictures there of how to do it. 1.36 on page 47, see that picture? Shows you how hard to press on your agar, right? 2 vertical, just right, 2 flat. So gives you helpful tips there. And then there's a practice on page 51 that we'll do later. But page 47, so a streak plate. The purpose of a streak plate is for dilution. So we're just working with 1 microbe, but what if you had been given a patient sample and you're trying to figure out what's making them sick? It may not be just 1 microbe, it may be multiple microbes. Well, if you just plate their whole sample as 1 giant plate, 1 nutrient agar plate, just rub it all on there, it's all gonna grow on top of each other and it's gonna look like a big mess. And picking out just 1, trying to isolate how many different microbes you have there would be very difficult. But if you do a streak plate and you dilute the sample out as you streak, then you can isolate individual microbes. And so what that looks like is, if this is our nutrient agar plate, so that's what we'll do the streak plate on. You have to visualize that there's 4 quadrants. So you don't draw 4 quadrants, you don't draw a big plus sign here. But you gotta visualize that there's 1. You're gonna dip, let me back up. For this one, you're gonna use the disposable yellow loops out of the drawer. The disposable loops out of the drawer. You will grab your first loop. You will dip it into your Serratia marcescens. You're going to come over here to one of your imaginary quadrants, and you're going to streak the Serratia on there into one of the quadrants. And you'll do a heavy streak, right? I've done a light one here. You'll do a heavy streak. So streak it onto quadrant 1. Throw that loop away. You get a second clean loop. And here's the part where I usually have some people who do this part up. Do not redip, right? You don't get more Serratia. You've already got what you need on your plate. Do not get more. You take a second sterile loop with nothing on it, and you're going to come over here to your second quadrant, and normally you would turn the plate so that it's not so awkward, but you're going to come over here to your second quadrant, and you're going to streak over and grab some of it out of the first quadrant and pull it over and inoculate it there. So do you already see how, if you grew this, quadrant 1 would have a lot of growth and quadrant 2 would have less, because you're only pulling some of what's in quadrant 1 over. Throw that loop away. Get a third sterile loop, come down to your third quadrant and do the same thing. Go over here and pull over from the first one and streak a third quadrant. Pull from the second quadrant. Throw that loop away, get a fourth one. And I've not done this well because I can't turn the plate. And then you streak from that one and pull it over. After we incubate this, and once you grow it, you're going to have a lot of growth here, probably a lot of growth here, less growth here, and you're going to have individual colonies growing here, where you'll be able to see if it's just Serratia or if you have Serratia and some other stuff in here too. They'll be spread out enough that you'll be able to tell that. Maybe not today because y'all aren't fixing to do this lab, but when you get to this point in lab on Thursday, either draw a circle just like I did on a sheet of paper, or there's a practice page on page 51 in your lab. Do it with a pencil or a pen first. It's awkward. It's very awkward to do it. Do it with a pen or a pencil first. Make sure you've at least got some practice with it before you try it on a plate. Okay? The other page I gave y'all was page 600, and I do not remember why I have that wrote down, so let me look and see why. Oh, page 600 has the instructions for doing a deep stab on a deep tube. Okay, one final bit of information here. What y'all need to this lab on Thursday, you're actually not really doing anything other than doing the lab. You're not gonna have any notes to take, you just took all the notes that you'll need to do the lab. And then I'll have to incubate these over the weekend, and then the following Tuesday, you'll actually get to look and see how well you did. So you won't have anything to write down until next Tuesday. What we'll do is we'll make a table that looks very similar to the table on page 43, but we won't make it until next Tuesday. And I'll walk y'all through what it is you're looking for on your different media that you transfer to. And we'll get a table drawn up, and it will look very similar to that. We'll have to modify it a little because I'm not using staff, and I had to do a few different transfers, but it'll look very similar to that.
And you said you're gonna provide that table?
I will help y'all, I will tell y'all what to set up on the table. You'll just mark out stuff on this table to take notes on, and then you'll create that table in your own lab report. Okay? So, do y'all feel like you could walk in here on Thursday and do this lab? Yes?
With the notes.
As of right now.
Yes. Today we can, right?
I will suggest there's some great videos on YouTube on all this.
There probably is.
There really are.